Imagine a town that appeared on no map, a sprawling, hidden metropolis of 50,000 souls that existed purely to birth the atomic age. They lived under a perpetual code of silence, building the invisible core of the most powerful weapon in history, yet they knew only rumors of its purpose. This was Hanford, Washington, the secret city where the plutonium for the Nagasaki bomb was forged. You've heard of Los Alamos, but it was here, in the isolated desert along the Columbia River, that the fuel for the fire was brewed. The people who lived there changed the world forever, but a deeper, stranger secret followed their monumental achievement. A classified, top-secret U.S. Air Force plan, codenamed Project A119, which sought to follow up the atomic bomb by detonating a nuclear device on the surface of the moon. The story of American exceptionalism and paranoia doesn't just end with a mushroom cloud over a distant nation. It involves the silent construction of a plutonium empire and a stunning, never-executed plot to make the ultimate statement of power visible to every human being on Earth. This is the unbelievable, forgotten chapter of American science, secrecy, and audacity. The Instant City and the Plutonium Dream. The tale of Hanford begins not with an explosion, but with a silent, ruthless eviction. In late 1942, as the world burned with the flames of World War II, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers needed a space that was vast, isolated, and blessed with an enormous supply of cold river water. The search parameters were extreme, demanding hundreds of square miles of flat, sparsely populated land. They found it in the arid plains of southeastern Washington state, a stretch of scrub brush and sagebrush where the mighty Columbia River makes a great bend. This area was home to small, quiet farming communities like Hanford and Richland, and to the ancestral fishing grounds of the Wanapum people. In the span of a few weeks in the winter of 1943, nearly 1,500 residents, farmers, homesteaders, and Native American families were given non-negotiable notice to vacate their homes, receiving pennies on the dollar for their land. The reasons were vague. The project was of extreme military necessity. The residents were simply erased from the landscape, their homes either bulldozed or commandeered for an unknowable purpose. The site, officially designed the Hanford Engineer Works, was the third and final pillar of the secret Manhattan Project, alongside Los Alamos, New Mexico, where the bomb was designed, and Oak Ridge, Tennessee, where uranium-235 was enriched. Hanford's mission was the most dangerous and conceptually challenging of all, to take ordinary uranium and transmute it, atom by atom, into a synthetic, never-before-seen element, plutonium. The impossible task, alchemy in the desert. The challenge of creating plutonium on an industrial scale was astronomical. Plutonium-239 is created by bombarding uranium-238 with neutrons inside a nuclear reactor. The resulting radioactive sludge must then be chemically separated, a process that was at the time entirely theoretical for large quantities. It was in essence a high-stakes industrial-scale act of nuclear alchemy. The project was overseen by DuPont, the chemical giant, under the iron-fisted authority of General Leslie Groves. Groves demanded a reactor of impossible size and power, a gargantuan machine capable of burning fissile material to produce weapons-grade plutonium. The resulting creation was the B Reactor, the world's first full-scale plutonium production reactor. A massive structure of graphite blocks, water pipes, and concrete shielding, the B Reactor was truly a wonder of panicked wartime engineering. It came online in late 1944, a triumph of logistics and sheer willpower. The surrounding facilities were equally immense. The vast empty landscape was transformed into a self-contained, high-security industrial park with thousands of temporary buildings, railroad spurs, and over 50,000 workers. This instant population surge made it Washington's third largest city almost overnight, yet it had no name on any public map, and its mail was only addressed to Box 100. Life in the shadow of the unknown. For the vast majority of the workers, daily life in the secret city was defined by secrecy and compartmentalization. They were building huge concrete structures, laying miles of pipe, and operating complex machinery, but they were specifically trained to only know their piece of the puzzle. An electrician knew nothing of a plumber's job. A reactor technician knew nothing of the chemical separation process. Workers were told rumors. They were building a massive power plant for the war effort, or perhaps a new kind of synthetic rubber factory. The signs posted everywhere reinforced the isolation. What you see here, what you do here, what you hear here, let it stay here. Even the scientists, led by figures like Dr. Kenneth Nichols, struggled with the unprecedented safety risks. No one truly understood the long-term effects of large-scale radiation exposure, yet the pressure to deliver was relentless. The plutonium slugs, chemically separated and purified in the massive canyon-like T plant, were packed up and shipped under the utmost security. This Hanford-produced plutonium was eventually formed into the core of the bomb named Fat Man, which was dropped on Nagasaki on August 9, 1945, helping to end the war. The immense, terrifying truth of what they had been building finally broke the silence, shocking the very people who had poured their lives into its creation. Part 2. The Cold War and Project A119. The war ended, but Hanford's importance only grew. The Cold War demanded a perpetual supply of nuclear material, and the Hanford site became the heart of America's nuclear arsenal, eventually operating 9 nuclear reactors and 5 massive chemical separation plants. The output from Hanford fueled the American deterrent for decades. It was in this atmosphere of intense, frantic competition with the Soviet Union that the idea for Project A119, known informally as the Moon Bomb Project, was born. The year was 1957. The Soviets had shocked the world by launching Sputnik 1, the first artificial satellite, proving a technological lead that terrified American military and political leaders. A public display of American might was deemed essential to restore faith and deter the enemy. The audacity of A119. The genesis of Project A119 was rooted in a question: how could the United States demonstrate its technological and military supremacy in a way that was undeniably visible to the entire globe? The answer, as put forth by the U.S. Air Force, was to launch an intercontinental ballistic missile, ICBM, carrying a small nuclear warhead and detonate it upon impact with the moon. The project was top secret, conducted by the Armor Research Foundation in Illinois. The team's mission was to calculate the feasibility and consequences of such a lunar detonation. The physicist brought in to head the calculations was a young, brilliant scientist named Dr. Leonard Reifel. Reifel's studies focused on critical questions. Visibility. Would the explosion be visible from Earth? The conclusion was a resounding yes. A small device detonated upon the dark side's terminator, the line between light and shadow, would create a mushroom cloud of lunar dust and rock that would catch the sunlight and be plainly visible to millions through telescopes or even the naked eye. It would be the ultimate, terrifying global fireworks display. Fallout. Could the fallout reach Earth? Reifel's team determined that the explosion would be high altitude, and the debris, while radioactive, would be so dispersed across the vacuum of space that it posed no biological hazard to Earth. The science cover. To mask the true intention of military display, the project was couched in terms of scientific inquiry, studying the geological composition of the moon. The ultimate horrifying goal, however, was psychological: to create a massive mushroom cloud visible from Earth, a demonstration of American firepower that would dwarf any previous human act. It was a cosmic brinksmanship. The quiet abandonment and a future famous face. Ultimately, Project A119 was canceled in 1959. Dr. Rifle and other scientists convinced the military leaders that the risks, both scientific and political, were too great. The potential for the rocket to fail on launch, scattering radioactive debris over Earth, was unacceptable. Furthermore, they argued that a scientific and peaceful approach, like the later Apollo program, would ultimately be a more powerful and enduring statement of American capability than a raw military flex. However, the story of A119 has an incredible footnote. One of the young scientists who worked on the highly sensitive calculations for the project was an aspiring astrophysicist who wrote a now infamous paper titled Possible Non-Terrestrial Effects of a Nuclear Detonation. That scientist's name was Carl Sagan, who would later become the most famous science popularizer of his generation, passionately advocating for the peaceful, scientific exploration of space, a complete repudiation of the military plan he had once secretly worked on. The Toxic Legacy and the Battle for Memory. While the moon bomb was relegated to the classified archives, the legacy of Hanford continued to reshape the American landscape in profound and often heartbreaking ways. The need for a rapid wartime nuclear stockpile meant that environmental and safety concerns were almost entirely ignored. Decades of relentless plutonium production, the necessary fuel for the Cold War, created a toxic disaster. The spent nuclear fuel rods, which contain a brew of long-lived radionuclides, were processed in the massive canyon-like chemical canyons using a technology called the bismuth phosphate process. This process left behind hundreds of millions of gallons of highly radioactive waste mixed with toxic chemicals. This waste was stored in 177 enormous underground storage tanks, many of which were of single-shell construction. The astonishing fact is that by the 1980s, dozens of these tanks were found to be leaking their deadly contents into the soil, slowly migrating toward the mighty Columbia River, the very lifeblood of the Pacific Northwest. The secret city that saved the world was now facing an environmental catastrophe of unparalleled scale. Today, the Hanford site is no longer a production facility, but the site of the most complex and expensive environmental cleanup effort in U.S. history. Hundreds of billions of dollars have been allocated to the task of retrieving and vitrifying the waste, a project that is expected to take decades, if not centuries, to complete. The historical reality of Hanford, its total secrecy, its essential role in the end of World War II, its connection to the dark side of space exploration, and its lingering toxic scar, serves as an astonishing testament to the high-stakes, ethically compromised, and ultimately world-changing decisions made in the name of national security. It is the story of an instant city, a hidden force, and the enduring radioactive truth that reality, especially in American history, is often stranger and far more costly than fiction. The scientists, the spies, and the secret trials. The creation of plutonium at Hanford was not merely an engineering feat. It was a psychological endurance test for the brilliant minds tasked with navigating uncharted waters in nuclear physics. They were pioneers in a landscape that could kill them, and the pressure was amplified by the constant paranoia of espionage. The plutonium problem and the deadly experiments. The core challenge faced by the metallurgists and chemists was not just making the plutonium, but figuring out how to handle it. Plutonium is a bizarre, mercurial element. It's pyrophoric. It can spontaneously combust in air, and exhibits a dangerous phenomenon known as criticality. If too much plutonium is brought together too quickly, it can initiate a chain reaction, releasing lethal bursts of radiation, a deadly, accidental mini-bomb. The most shocking aspect of the research involved the lengths scientists went to understand how plutonium would behave in the human body. Because the element was new and its long-term effects unknown, a series of deeply controversial secret medical experiments were initiated. From 1945 to 1947, a small number of unsuspecting hospital patients, most of them terminally ill or suffering from conditions that minimized the scientific impact of their death, were injected with tiny, controlled doses of plutonium. These injections, carried out at hospitals in Rochester, Chicago, and the University of California at San Francisco, were done without the patient's informed consent. The purpose was to track how quickly and where plutonium was absorbed and excreted, providing crucial data for determining occupational safety standards for the thousands of workers at Hanford and other nuclear sites. This chilling program, known as the Human Radiation Experiments, remained classified for decades. It stands as one of the darkest chapters of American science, a cold, calculated ethical violation committed in the name of national security, justified by the scientists as a necessary evil to protect the lives of the workers who handled the increasingly vast plutonium arsenal. The guarded river, Columbia's hotspots. While the scientists grappled with unseen dangers in their labs, the vast industrial machinery of the Hanford site was dumping enormous quantities of low-level radioactive material directly into the Columbia River. The river was a controlled environment, heavily guarded, but the effects were local and immediate. Fishermen and farmers living downstream were given vague warnings about consuming too much fish, yet the full extent of the contamination was downplayed or completely hidden. Astonishingly, the most common radioactive release was a deliberate, controlled decision to vent huge volumes of radioactive iodine-131 into the atmosphere. This occurred during the crucial early separations process. One significant event, in late 1944, was the massive Green Run, a secretive test where large quantities of highly irradiated uranium were processed quickly to analyze the resulting plutonium purity. The process released an estimated 8,000 curies of iodine-131 into the environment, contaminating hundreds of thousands of acres of farmland and posing a serious, if then unknown, risk to the local population, who were subsequently nicknamed Downwinders. For years, the government denied any harm, creating a toxic level of public distrust that lasts to this day. The Russian spy who walked free. The extreme security and compartmentalization were a direct result of the fear of Soviet espionage. Yet perhaps the most stunning failure of wartime security involved the famed theoretical physicist Klaus Fuchs. Fuchs, a German-born scientist who had worked at the UK end of the program, was a key figure brought to the US to work on the bomb design at Los Alamos. His knowledge was encyclopedic and extended to the most intricate details of the plutonium implosion device, which relied entirely on the material produced at Hanford. Astonishingly, Fuchs was a dedicated communist who had been an active Soviet spy throughout the entire Manhattan Project. He passed on blueprints, mathematical calculations, and detailed processes to his Soviet handlers, providing Stalin's project with an enormous years-long head start. The sheer audacity of Fuchs's betrayal, a quiet, seemingly unassuming man operating at the highest levels of American nuclear secrecy, is an astounding historical fact. His information, particularly concerning the necessary critical mass and implosion lens design for the plutonium bomb, Fat Man, allowed the Soviets to build their own atomic weapon, First Lightning, in 1949, far earlier than U.S. intelligence predicted. Fuchs's espionage fundamentally altered the global balance of power, effectively ending America's nuclear monopoly and accelerating the terrifying nuclear arms race that defined the Cold War. Fuchs was eventually caught in 1950, not by American counterintelligence, but by British security services. His quiet confession revealed the shocking depth of the security breach, confirming that the Soviet Union did not steal the bomb. It was handed to them by a scientist who worked among the very people who created it. The Hanford site, in this light, was not just a manufacturing plant. It was the nexus of scientific brilliance, cold-hearted ethical compromises, and a catastrophic intelligence failure that defined the future of modern warfare. The Cold War escalated and the veil frayed. As the 1950s advanced, the demands of the Cold War created a frenzy of production at the Hanford site. The United States and the Soviet Union were engaged in a terrifying nuclear arms race, necessitating a constant, colossal output of plutonium. This era marked the peak of Hanford's industrial power, where 9 reactors, including the massive N reactor, capable of producing both weapons-grade plutonium and electric power, ran around the clock. The nuclear leviathan and its casualties. The intense pressure to produce meant that all 9 reactors operated in a continuous cycle, drawing billions of gallons of cooling water from the Columbia River, a cycle that also inevitably meant billions of gallons of contaminated water returned to it. The massive concrete canyons where chemical separation occurred worked ceaselessly, creating the massive underground waste problem mentioned previously. The astonishing hidden cost was the human toll among the workers. Safety procedures were, by modern standards, catastrophically inadequate. Workers were routinely exposed to low-level radiation, often called the Hanford glow, and internal records show a pattern of downplaying or outright ignoring health concerns. Medical screenings were mandatory, but the emphasis was on protecting the mission, not the workers. A shocking number of workers were exposed to various forms of radioactives, either through direct handling, inhaling contaminated dust, or ingesting minute amounts. The internal records, often suppressed, showed concerning trends in cancers and other radiation-related illnesses. The government and DuPont, the managing contractor, created a powerful culture of silence. Questioning safety was deemed unpatriotic and a threat to national security. The workers, the foot soldiers of the nuclear age, were left to suffer the consequences of their invisible wartime service in silence. The secret cities and the perfect American facade. The families who lived near the site, particularly in the nearby secret community of Richland, were part of the strange new American nuclear identity. Richland was a federally owned, controlled, and entirely planned city, built specifically to house the scientists and engineers. It was a perfectly manicured suburban fantasy. Nice houses, known as alphabet houses, due to their floor plan designations, A, B, C, D. Immaculate lawns, top-tier schools, and a powerful sense of shared purpose. Life in Richland was the epitome of post-war American comfort, built directly on top of a terrifying secret. The city's high school mascot was the Richland Bombers, and the school logo featured a mushroom cloud. This astonishing cultural detail, celebrating the symbol of mass destruction, epitomizes the bizarre normalization of nuclear culture that was necessary to maintain the secrecy and morale of the bomb makers. For decades, the residents lived under the constant, silent threat of contamination, entirely unaware of the scale of the iodine-131 releases or the leaking underground tanks. They were patriots living a comfortable life protected by a national secret that simultaneously endangered their health. The reckoning and the toxic truth. The decades of state-enforced silence could not last forever. The beginning of the end for Hanford's secrecy came in the 1970s and 1980s, driven by courageous whistleblowers and determined journalists. The leaking tanks and the $100 billion problem. The most astonishing physical evidence of the historical cover-up was the discovery of the leaking single-shell tanks. Beginning in the 1970s, it became impossible for the Department of Energy, DOE, to deny that the aging tanks, some holding over 1 million gallons of liquid high-level waste, were failing. By the time the truth fully emerged, more than 1 million gallons of deadly, chemically complex radioactive sludge had escaped into the Earth. This environmental calamity led to a landmark agreement in 1989, the Tri-Party Agreement, TPA, signed by the DOE, the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, and the Washington State Department of Ecology. This agreement officially launched the cleanup mission, a task so vast it was designated the largest, most technologically challenging, and most expensive environmental restoration project in human history. The cost is now projected to exceed $100 billion and last until at least 2070. The astonishing reality is that this one secret wartime industrial project has generated more environmental risk and a higher cleanup bill than any other single site in the United States. The Downwinders and the pursuit of justice. The human cost also became a public fight. The citizens who lived downwind of Hanford, particularly those whose families had been exposed to the deliberate iodine-131 releases and the contaminated river water, banded together. They became known as the Downwinders, and they launched a historic legal battle against the government and its contractors. Through the legal process, thousands of formerly secret documents, the very internal reports that detailed the Green Run and the human radiation experiments, were finally declassified. The public was confronted with the horrifying truth. The government had known about the risks to its own citizens and had actively concealed them for decades. The resulting lawsuits brought the ethical compromises of the Cold War into sharp focus. While not all cases succeeded, the struggle for compensation and acknowledgement forced a national discussion about the hidden casualties of the nuclear age and established a precedent for accountability in government science. The unfolding legacy of the atomic state. Hanford site is more than just a place of cleanup. It is a lens through which to understand the development of the modern American national security state. The invisible economy of the atom. From the 1940s through the 1980s, the nuclear production complex, of which Hanford was the manufacturing backbone, represented an astonishing secret shadow economy. Huge swaths of the U.S. budget, infrastructure, and scientific community were silently directed by the Department of Defense and the Atomic Energy Commission, AEC, bypassing normal civilian oversight. The technology and wealth generated by Hanford created a new scientific and political class, forever entrenching the link between science, military power, and massive federal spending. The legacy extends far beyond the bomb, touching everything from America's electrical grid, with commercial nuclear power being a direct outgrowth of military reactor design, to Cold War university research. The truth of American exceptionalism. The astonishing true story of the Hanford Engineer Works reveals a complex truth about American exceptionalism. Unprecedented achievement. It represents a miraculous, urgent triumph of organization and engineering, proving the nation's capacity for focused, collective effort to meet an existential threat. Unaccountable power. It demonstrates the government's willingness to suspend democratic transparency, disregard the environment, and compromise the health of its own citizens in the name of a greater national good. The site, now a monument to both achievement and error, forces the American audience to confront the ethical trade-offs of its own superpower status. The secret city, which saved the world from fascism and then accelerated the terror of the Cold War, stands as the enduring physical proof that progress and peril are often inseparable. The final silent lesson of Hanford is that the most powerful forces unleashed by American ingenuity are not the explosions themselves, but the long-term, invisible, and irreversible consequences that follow. The fight to contain the danger and to communicate the warning across millennia is the final, continuing act of the Cold War. The guts of the beast, inside the B Reactor. The B Reactor was not merely a large building, it was the world's first full-scale factory for nuclear transformation. Its existence depended on engineering solutions that were as ingenious as they were terrifyingly crude, built under a crushing deadline. The graphite block and the control rods. The core of the B Reactor was a massive cube of tens of thousands of precisely machined graphite blocks. Graphite was chosen because of its ability to act as a moderator, slowing down the fast-moving neutrons released by the uranium fuel just enough so they could be absorbed by other uranium atoms, sustaining the chain reaction. The success of the Manhattan Project hinged on the purity of this graphite. Even tiny impurities of boron could prematurely poison the reactor and halt the nuclear process. The reactor itself was pierced by 2004 aluminum tubes running horizontally through the graphite. These were the fuel channels into which thousands of aluminum-jacketed uranium slugs were pushed. The slugs, each about 8 inches long, were the fuel, and their transformation into plutonium was the B reactor's singular goal. To control this latent power, engineers devised a system of control rods, long tubes made of boron steel, a material that absorbs neutrons incredibly effectively. These rods were inserted into the core. Pushing them in slowed the reaction. Pulling them out allowed it to accelerate. The safety of the entire Manhattan Project and the world literally rested on the smooth, rapid function of these control rods. The xenon poisoning crisis, the moment of near failure. The moment the B reactor was first brought to power in late 1944 was one of the most astonishing near catastrophes in scientific history. Initial startup proceeded smoothly, but within hours, the power mysteriously began to drop. By the next day, the chain reaction had died completely. The reactor had been poisoned. Panic gripped the scientific community. The chief physicist, Enrico Fermi, was summoned. His team quickly calculated that a previously unknown, highly potent radioactive fission product, xenon-135, was acting as a colossal neutron sponge, halting the reaction. This gas was a product of the uranium fission itself, and its ravenous appetite for neutrons had simply not been anticipated in the frantic theoretical design phase. The astonishing resolution was that the reactor's engineers, on orders from General Groves, had already built the B reactor to be significantly oversized as a precaution against unknown factors. Fermi realized the core was designed with far more fuel channels than were initially deemed necessary. By overriding the initial plan and fully loading the remaining fuel channels, the sheer volume of fissile material was increased enough to overwhelm the xenon-135 poison. The reaction stabilized, production resumed, and the incident became a legendary, terrifying footnote. The nuclear age was nearly aborted by an invisible, unexpected gas. The architecture of secrecy, the canyon buildings. Once the uranium slugs had been irradiated in the B reactor, they were chemically processed to extract the plutonium. This task was performed in the canyons, the massive 5-story high separation buildings known by their code names T-plant, U-plant, B-plant, etc. A mile-long factory and the absence of man. The separation of plutonium, a highly radioactive and intensely toxic process, could not be performed by humans. Therefore, the canyon buildings were designed as the ultimate realization of remote-controlled architecture. These structures were almost a mile long and had 66 processing cells, each a thick concrete vault designed to contain the highly corrosive and radioactive slurry. This extreme design was a testament to the deadly nature of the new element. The workers in the control rooms were physically shielded from the hot material, yet the incredible complexity of the remote maintenance, often requiring an operator to feel for a broken latch using a crane hook from dozens of feet away, created a new kind of engineering heroism. The canyons were not just factories, they were the first great monuments to a science too dangerous for human touch. A staggering realization of robotic-like engineering years ahead of its time, conceived purely out of necessity for survival. The fact that this mile-long, remotely operated factory existed in the middle of the Washington desert, utterly hidden from the world, remains one of the greatest organizational achievements of the 20th century. The picket fence and the mushroom cloud. Life in Richland. The social structure built to support the Hanford Engineer Works was as meticulously engineered as the B Reactor itself. The city of Richland, located just outside the restricted zone, was an astonishing federally owned, planned community designed not just for housing, but for maintaining absolute secrecy and high morale among the nuclear elite. The alphabet houses, a hierarchy of comfort. Richland's residential design was a brilliant, if slightly Orwellian, piece of social engineering. Housing was strictly assigned based on the worker's rank and salary, creating an immediate visible hierarchy. These homes were known as alphabet houses, classified by their floor plans. A, B, and C houses, small utilitarian duplexes or row houses, often reserved for laborers and lower-tier technical staff. D and E houses, larger single-family detached homes reserved for mid-level engineers, foremen, and supervisors. F and G houses, the largest, most luxurious houses, often situated near the Columbia River, reserved for the top scientists, executives, and military commanders. The houses were all built by the same contractors in the same years, yet the subtle difference in square footage and placement served to both attract highly skilled talent and maintain social order in a hyper-stressful environment. This astonishing blend of military efficiency and suburban comfort created a surreal atmosphere. Residents lived the idyllic American dream behind a picket fence, all while being profoundly isolated and sworn to absolute silence about their world-altering work. The Richland Bombers, culture in the shadow of the atom. The most enduring and astonishing cultural artifact of the secret city was its absolute embrace of its nuclear identity. The local high school, Richland High School, adopted the name the Bombers. Their logo was, and remains, a mushroom cloud. This normalization of the atom bomb was a psychological necessity. By turning the ultimate instrument of destruction into a symbol of local pride, the community sublimated its fear and the ethical weight of its secret into a symbol of victory and achievement. The mushroom cloud was displayed on gym floors, football helmets, and yearbooks. It was a bizarre, unparalleled instance of a community outwardly celebrating its profound contribution to mass warfare. A celebration rooted in patriotism and a deep shared sense of historical importance, even if the specifics of that history were classified. The bubble and the bunkers. Life in Richland became a protected, isolated bubble. The government ensured a high quality of life with subsidized services, excellent schools, and a powerful sense of unity, all designed to discourage employees from leaving and potentially breaking security. Beneath the pleasant surface, however, lurked the anxiety of the Cold War. The residents knew their community, home to the nation's primary source of nuclear fuel, would be a prime target for a Soviet attack. Many families had backyard bomb shelters, and the culture was one of preparedness, combined with a forced, cheerful denial. The juxtaposition of a tranquil, highly rated school district and the constant underlying threat of nuclear annihilation made Richland one of the most uniquely American towns of the 20th century. Part 13. The Architects of Silence. Groves and the Secrecy Machine. The entire social and physical structure of Hanford was a reflection of the man who ran the Manhattan Project, General Leslie Groves. Groves, a gruff, fiercely effective military engineer, was perhaps the most astonishing administrator of the 20th century. The manager of the impossible, the justice of the Downwinders, unearthing the human experiments. The decades of silence and the culture of compartmentalization installed by General Groves began to crumble in the late 1980s and 1990s, not through congressional inquiry, but through the determined actions of ordinary citizens and a stunning governmental admission of past ethical breaches. The Downwinders' legal war. The citizens living downstream and downwind of the Hanford site, who had suffered from unexplained clusters of illnesses, organized one of the most significant environmental and health lawsuits in American history. They faced a monumental hurdle, proving a direct causal link between the secretive, undocumented radiation releases and their individual illnesses decades later. The astonishing legal battle, which stretched over 25 years, forced the Department of Energy, DOE, to declassify nearly 1 million historical documents. These documents, internal memos, safety reports, and radiation monitoring logs, did more than just confirm the iodine-131 releases. They offered an unprecedented window into the government's knowledge and actions during the Cold War. This public disclosure became known as the Hanford Historical Documents Project. The sheer volume of the release and the explicit nature of the internal records, which often showed scientists estimating the effect of releases on local populations, was a shocking revelation of the government's priorities. The collective health of the community was for decades secondary to the urgent production of nuclear material. The lawsuit resulted in numerous settlements, acknowledging the government's negligence and providing compensation to thousands of plaintiffs. This legal fight marked a crucial turning point, forcing the national security state to finally acknowledge the casualties of its hidden war. The shocking truth of the plutonium injections. Simultaneously, investigative journalists and academic researchers uncovered an even darker secret dating back to the war's end: the human radiation experiments. While discussed briefly in the early parts of this story, the full scale of the revelation was a national trauma. Between 1945 and 1947, and continuing in some form for decades, the Manhattan Project's medical officers authorized the injection of plutonium, polonium, and uranium into at least 60 American citizens. The vast majority of these people were non-consenting hospital patients. Some were mentally disabled, others terminally ill, and many were poor or otherwise marginalized. The official justification was the cold, utilitarian need to calculate how plutonium behaved once inside the human body, information deemed vital to protect the thousands of workers at Hanford. The astonishing ethical failure lay in the utter disregard for human rights and autonomy. The 1993 public exposure of this program led to a major review led by then Secretary of Energy Hazel O'Leary, who opened the archives and created the Advisory Committee on Human Radiation Experiments, ACHRE. The committee's final report confirmed the experiments, detailing the astonishing breadth of scientific hubris and secrecy. The subsequent national apology and monetary compensation to the victims' families served as a profound, if belated, acknowledgement that even in wartime, the ends do not always justify the means. The justice of the Downwinders, unearthing the human experiments. The decades of silence and the culture of compartmentalization installed by General Groves began to crumble in the late 1980s and 1990s, not through congressional inquiry, but through the determined actions of ordinary citizens and a stunning governmental admission of past ethical breaches. The Downwinders' legal war. The citizens living downstream and downwind of the Hanford site, who had suffered from unexplained clusters of illnesses, organized one of the most significant environmental and health lawsuits in American history. They faced a monumental hurdle, proving a direct causal link between the secretive, undocumented radiation releases and their individual illnesses decades later. The astonishing legal battle, which stretched over 25 years, forced the Department of Energy, DOE, to declassify nearly 1 million historical documents. These documents, internal memos, safety reports, and radiation monitoring logs, did more than just confirm the iodine-131 releases. They offered an unprecedented window into the government's knowledge and actions during the Cold War. This public disclosure became known as the Hanford Historical Documents Project. The sheer volume of the release and the explicit nature of the internal records, which often showed scientists estimating the effect of releases on local populations, was a shocking revelation of the government's priorities. The collective health of the community was for decades secondary to the urgent production of nuclear material. The lawsuit resulted in numerous settlements, acknowledging the government's negligence and providing compensation to thousands of plaintiffs. This legal fight marked a crucial turning point, forcing the national security state to finally acknowledge the casualties of its hidden war. The shocking truth of the plutonium injections. Simultaneously, investigative journalists and academic researchers uncovered an even darker secret dating back to the war's end: the human radiation experiments. While discussed briefly in the early parts of this story, the full scale of the revelation was a national trauma. Between 1945 and 1947, and continuing in some form for decades, the Manhattan Project's medical officers authorized the injection of plutonium, polonium, and uranium into at least 60 American citizens. The vast majority of these people were non-consenting hospital patients. Some were mentally disabled, others terminally ill, and many were poor or otherwise marginalized. The official justification was the cold, utilitarian need to calculate how plutonium behaved once inside the human body, information deemed vital to protect the thousands of workers at Hanford. The astonishing ethical failure lay in the utter disregard for human rights and autonomy. The 1993 public exposure of this program led to a major review led by then Secretary of Energy Hazel O'Leary, who opened the archives and created the Advisory Committee on Human Radiation Experiments, ACHRE. The committee's final report confirmed the experiments, detailing the astonishing breadth of scientific hubris and secrecy. The subsequent national apology and monetary compensation to the victims' families served as a profound, if belated, acknowledgement that even in wartime, the ends do not always justify the means. The $100 billion cleanup, the second great engineering feat. After decades of production, the Hanford site faces a problem orders of magnitude larger than the original challenge of creating the bomb: cleaning up the mess. This task, now projected to cost over $100 billion and last for decades, has become the second great engineering epic of Hanford. The problem of the leaking tanks. The central crisis is the 177 underground storage tanks, many of the original single-shell variety, containing a mixed radioactive and chemical waste cocktail. This slurry includes long-lived radionuclides like cesium-137, strontium-90, and the ever-present plutonium-239, dissolved in highly corrosive, chemically complex liquids. As these tanks leak, and dozens have, the toxic plume slowly migrates through the soil toward the Columbia River. The astonishing challenge is twofold. First, retrieving the highly viscous sludge-like waste, known as sludge or salt cake, from tanks that were never designed to be emptied, and second, stabilizing it for millennia. The robotic retrieval and the technological marvels. The solution has required a new generation of remote-controlled, nuclear-hardened robotics, creating an astonishing new technological frontier. Pumping and jetting. To retrieve the waste, engineers use specialized long-armed robotic sluicing systems that enter the tanks through small risers. These systems blast the sludge with high-pressure streams of water and chemicals, turning the solid waste back into a pumpable slurry. The high-resolution cameras and sensors on these robots are necessary because human entry is impossible. The radiation levels inside the tanks are instantly lethal. Vitrification. The ultimate destination for this retrieved slurry is the Hanford Tank Treatment Plant, the VIT plant. This is perhaps the most ambitious piece of engineering on the site. The process of vitrification involves mixing the radioactive waste with glass-forming materials, like silica and boron, and heating the mixture to over 2100 degrees Fahrenheit, or 1150 degrees Celsius. The waste is melted and permanently incorporated into a stable, durable form of glass. The astonishing feature of the VIT plant is its scale and complexity. It is essentially a custom-built, multi-billion-dollar nuclear glass factory designed to operate remotely for decades. The molten radioactive glass is poured into massive stainless steel canisters, which are then sealed and stored in an on-site deep geological repository. The glass solidifies the waste, trapping the radionuclides so they cannot leach into the environment, securing the atomic residue for the next 10,000 years. The barrier of the Earth. Beyond the tanks, engineers have tackled the contaminated groundwater plume with another astonishing technique: pump and treat. Massive wells pump contaminated groundwater to the surface, where it is processed through chemical filters to remove uranium, iodine, and other contaminants. For plumes closer to the surface, engineers deploy bioremediation, introducing specialized organic compounds to stimulate native soil microbes that can chemically convert harmful metals and radionuclides into less mobile, less harmful forms. The modern Hanford site is a living laboratory of Cold War atonement. The effort is a staggering illustration of American technological power turned inward, working to correct the errors of its past. The cleanup is a slow, costly, and dangerous war against time and invisible toxicity, demonstrating that the environmental and human legacy of the atomic age is not a historical footnote, but a continuing massive commitment of resources. From deception to dedication, the National Historical Park. The final, astonishing metamorphosis of the Hanford site is its transition from the nation's most impenetrable secret to a place of public education and remembrance. This transformation is a complex acknowledgement of both the site's world-altering significance and its profound moral cost. The B Reactor's second life. The most powerful symbol of this change is the B Reactor itself, which in 2015 became a central part of the Manhattan Project National Historical Park. The site that once operated under total military control now offers public tours, attracting visitors from around the globe. To walk inside the B Reactor today is a surreal experience. You stand before the massive graphite cube, now silent and inert, where the plutonium that ended World War II was forged. The sheer scale of the apparatus, the rows of fuel channels, the thick concrete shielding, the maze of pipes testifies to the ingenuity of the wartime effort. However, the preservation is not just a celebration of American scientific might. The tours and interpretive centers actively grapple with the ethical paradox of the Manhattan Project, the necessity of the bomb to end one war versus the terrifying nuclear arms race it initiated. The park serves as a crucial, tangible space where Americans can directly confront the origins of the nuclear age and the moral complexities of ultimate power. The decision to preserve the site is an astonishing admission that this dark chapter of history is too important to be merely cleaned up and forgotten. The cultural shift of the bombers. Even the cultural symbol of the secret city has undergone a profound, if slow, evolution. While Richland High School retains the bomber's name and the mushroom cloud logo, the meaning attached to the symbol has shifted. After decades of protest and national scrutiny, the community now often reframes the mascot less as a celebration of destruction and more as a nod to the historical bravery, ingenuity, and unique identity of the people who worked there, the scientists, engineers, and laborers who delivered on an impossible task. Yet the continued presence of the mushroom cloud on a high school gymnasium remains an astonishing symbol, a constant visible tension between patriotic pride in a technological achievement and the solemn recognition of its consequences. Part 17. The Unending Legacy, Hanford's Message to the Future. The true, enduring legacy of the Hanford site is not found in the settlements paid to the Downwinders or the technology used in the cleanup, but in the questions it forces upon the American consciousness. The problem of trust. Hanford irrevocably changed the nature of public trust in government and science. The decades of active concealment concerning the environmental releases and the human experiments created a toxic, lasting suspicion that once the state invokes national security, democratic accountability is suspended. The site stands as a permanent reminder that the pursuit of ultimate security can lead to profound ethical compromises against the nation's own people. The long-term stewardship. Ultimately, the most astonishing aspect of Hanford's legacy is the need for intergenerational commitment. The $100 billion cleanup is not the final answer. It is merely the process of creating a new, contained problem. The vitrified waste secured in its massive glass blocks requires perpetual, stable monitoring. This means that the current civilization must successfully transmit its knowledge and its warning to the next 100 generations. Hanford embodies the ultimate ethical mandate to protect future unborn people from the consequences of decisions made in the brief, frantic span of the 20th century. The quiet desert along the Columbia River, once the birthplace of the atomic age, has become the world's most enduring monument to the unending responsibility that comes with ultimate power. The story of Hanford, from secret eviction to nuclear alchemy, from a lunar bomb fantasy to an environmental catastrophe, and finally to a historic park, is the astonishing true story of America's superpower evolution, a narrative of unmatched ambition and its equally unmatched enduring cost.